seems like every day I open the newspaper in Canada and I'm reading about whether or not we're going to have an election. It looks like we're not going to have an election at this point. It's the end of October and there's probably not enough time before Christmas to have that election. So probably the politicians won't do it. But at the same time, they're jockeying for position. So the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, keeps goading the leader of the opposition, Michael Ignatieff, into trying to say that he's going to raise taxes because we have this big deficit and the deficit's growing. And Prime Minister Harper is trying to goad Michael Ignatieff into saying that the deficit fighting has to be the first priority, and how actually is he going to do it. All of this is an attempt to make the primary agenda for the next election an economic agenda. Now the thing is, Harper, when he became Prime Minister, inherited a fiscal surplus. What did he do with that fiscal surplus? Well, first of all, he cut taxes. He cut the goods and services tax, first of all from 7% to 6%, and then from 6% to 5%. Well, that's worth about $11 billion a year in revenue for every 1% of tax cut. Secondly, he started spending more money. And the spending of more money increased significantly when the economic crisis hit. When the economic crisis hit, of course, revenue went down, so there are three different ways in which the fiscal deficit has been created. Harper is trying to take attention away from the fact that two out of those three ways the deficit's been created have to do with his government. And he's trying to scare the Canadian public into thinking that the opposition leader, if he became Prime Minister, would simply be raising taxes. This puts Michael Ignatieff into the absurd position of saying, oh no, he wouldn't raise taxes because the deficit's going to solve itself. As soon as the economy rebounds, the economy is going to grow, it's going to generate new revenue, and the government accounts will automatically be put into a surplus position. Well, of course, that's absurd. I want to know when we're going to start talking honestly to each other, as politicians to politicians, as politicians to the public, and as members of the public to other members of the public. We know that eventually this recession is going to come around. We know that eventually it's going to end. So yes, that does mean the economy eventually is going to expand, and that will increase government revenues. Is it going to bring the government accounts back into balance? Well, of course it's not. Fundamentally, we are going to have to raise taxes. The question is, which taxes are we going to raise? Are we going to raise the goods and services tax another 2 percentage points and bring in, what, another $22 billion a year? Or are we going to raise income taxes? Or is there some other kind of tax revenue, some kind of fee structure that can be introduced to raise that kind of money? One way or another, we're going to have to raise taxes. Why aren't we talking about it? The odd thing is that both political leaders are running against the history of their party. The GST was an idea introduced by Harper's predecessor, Brian Mulroney. Michael Ignatieff's predecessor, Jean Chrétien, ran and became Prime Minister on the promise that he would get rid of the GST, but of course he kept it because it generates an enormous amount of money. Now, Harper's predecessor, Brian Mulroney, campaigned again and again and again against the federal deficit. Did he slay it? No, he didn't. Who slayed it? Well, actually, it was Jean Chrétien's government that slayed it. But how did he slay it? Well, one of the ways he slayed it was, of course, by allowing the GST to be there, not canceling it. The other way he slayed it was by transferring the costs of federal programs onto the provinces. He cut $7 billion a year from health, education, and welfare, and made that, those are services that are delivered by the provinces. So it's the federal government under Liberal leadership that created the environment for massive cuts to health, education, and welfare delivered by the provinces all across the country. So how did the Liberal government solve the deficit problem? Well, on the backs of the ill, on the backs of the poor, and on the backs of the young. That's how they did it. So here's where I stand. I actually want the government to raise my taxes. And in the next election, I want to debate about, are those taxes going to be raised through the progressive income tax system, or are they going to be raised on the flat tax basis through consumption? Am I worried about this? Yes, I am. Why am I worried about it? I'm worried about it because I think that Prime Minister Harper might actually solve the deficit problem by cutting federal programs that the poor, the young, and the sick depend on. I worry about the Liberal plan because it's the Liberals who actually solve the deficit exactly this way. From my point of view, we should all be paying for this together because we're all in this problem together. We're all in the same boat. Why is that so hard to talk about? Now, there's a funny story that a professor at the University of Toronto, Joseph Heath, tells in his book called Filthy Lucre. Joseph Heath is in an auto repair shop, and there's a woman ahead of him who's getting her bill, and she says, "Now, show me where the taxes are on this bill. I just want to know how much money those filthy bastards are taking from me." So she's arguing with the attendant at the auto repair shop, and finally she says, "Oh, I don't have time for this. I have to go. I'm late for my work at the hospital." And so Joseph Heath says, "Wait a minute, you're a nurse?" She says, "Yes." And he said, "You work at a public hospital?" "Well, of course she works at a public hospital. All the hospitals in Canada are public." And he says, "Well, so that means that your wages are being paid for by government taxes. So you complaining about paying taxes on your auto repair bill is like Tom Cruise arguing about the price of movie tickets." Well, of course, everybody laughs. Heath's point is that the right wing has convinced the general public that taxes are a kind of parasite on the real economy. Well, actually, government action can create wealth just like the private sector can create wealth. Whether a hospital is run by the government or whether it's run by the private sector, it's going to contribute just as much to the public welfare and just as much to the GDP, all other things being equal. This attitude is deeply rooted in large parts of the United States and in some parts of Canada. I'm always delighted in the alternative attitude, which I found so often in Saskatchewan, and that is that the government's the biggest co-op we've got going. Healthy attitude, that. This has been the Moral Economy column for October 2009. The Moral Economy column is published in print in the Western Producer, Canada's largest farm newspaper, and also on the internet through my website, christopherlynn.ca. If you'd like to receive an email copy of my column, published every 6 weeks, send me a message at office@christopherlynn.ca. Thanks.